A Karen accuses me of growing illegal plants in my backyard, all because I'm Mexican, despite my insistence that they're just tomatoes. She takes it one step further by calling the police. And here's what happened when they arrived. So, I'm a 29-year-old Mexican guy living in the United States, and I've recently discovered a passion for gardening, thanks to my wife. She's always been into plants, and it turns out I have a green thumb too. Our little backyard has turned into our pride and joy, with all sorts of flowers, herbs, and vegetables growing in every corner. One of our favorite things to grow is tomatoes, not only because they're relatively easy to grow, but also because they're a staple in Mexican cuisine, and we love using fresh tomatoes in our homemade salsas, guacamole, and other dishes. We've got a few tomato plants scattered around the yard, but one in particular has been doing exceptionally well. It's grown pretty tall and has a bunch of plump, juicy tomatoes on it. Now, let me give you some context about our neighborhood. It's a fairly diverse area, with people of all different backgrounds living here. However, there's one neighbor who's been causing some issues lately. We'll call her Karen, and she's the epitome of the entitled, nosy, and judgmental neighbor that nobody wants to have. One sunny afternoon, I was out tending to my tomato plants when Karen decided to come over and strike up a conversation. I could tell she was eyeing my plants, and I figured she might be curious about them, so I tried to be friendly. "Hey Karen, how's it going?" I asked, trying to sound welcoming. She approached me with a suspicious look on her face and pointed at my tallest tomato plant. "What's that you're growing there?" she demanded. "It's a tomato plant," I replied, genuinely proud of my gardening accomplishments. "We love using fresh tomatoes in our cooking." Karen narrowed her eyes and shook her head. "That doesn't look like a tomato plant to me," she said, her voice dripping with suspicion. "It looks like one of those illegal plants. You know, marijuana." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. The ignorance was astounding. I tried to keep my cool and not let her accusations get to me. No, Karen. This is definitely a tomato plant. See the tomatoes growing on it?" I gestured to the red fruit hanging from the branches, but she wouldn't back down. "Well, I've heard that Mexicans are contributing to the drug problem in this country," she spat, "so I wouldn't be surprised if you were growing marijuana in your backyard." I was fuming at this point. Not only was she accusing me of growing illegal plants, but she was also making racist assumptions about me based on my nationality. "Look, Karen," I said, trying to remain calm. "This is a tomato plant. I don't know what you're talking about, and I don't appreciate your racist comments." She just huffed and stormed off back to her house, muttering something under her breath about calling the police. I didn't take her threat seriously, thinking she was just being dramatic. I continued to tend to my plants, trying to shake off the interaction and not let it ruin my day. But little did I know, Karen was actually on the phone with the police, reporting me for growing marijuana in my backyard. About an hour later, as I was finishing up my gardening, I heard a knock on my door. To my surprise, there were two police officers standing on my doorstep. Confused and slightly panicked, I asked what was going on. "Sir, we received a report that you might be growing marijuana plants in your backyard," one of the officers said. "We're going to need to take a look." I was dumbfounded. I couldn't believe that Karen had actually called the police on me for growing tomatoes. But I knew I had nothing to hide, so I reluctantly agreed to let them inspect my garden. As I led them to the backyard, I couldn't help but feel a mix of frustration and embarrassment. Here I was, showing two police officers my tomato plants because of a nosy, entitled, and ignorant neighbor. When we reached the garden, I pointed out the tomato plant in question, trying to keep my voice steady. "This is the plant that Karen was talking about," I said, gesturing to the tall tomato plant. "As you can see, it's clearly a tomato plant, not marijuana." The officers inspected the plant, and it was evident that they could see it was indeed a tomato plant. One of them chuckled and shook his head. "I'm sorry for the inconvenience, sir. We have to follow up on reports, but it's clear that this is just a misunderstanding." I nodded, trying to be understanding, even though I was still seething at Karen's actions. "I get it. You're just doing your job, but it's frustrating to be accused of something like this just because of a neighbor's ignorance." The officers apologized again and left, and I couldn't help but glance over at Karen's house as they walked away. I could see her peering out from behind her curtains, a disappointed look on her face when she realized the police weren't going to arrest me or anything. In the days that followed, I decided to take the high road and not confront Karen about the incident. I didn't want to give her the satisfaction of knowing she'd gotten under my skin. Instead, I continued to tend to my garden, growing even more beautiful and bountiful tomato plants as a sort of silent revenge. Now my wife and I have always been known in the neighborhood for our delicious Mexican cuisine. We love inviting our neighbors over to share meals, and we often give out dishes to those around us as a gesture of friendliness and goodwill. But after the whole tomato fiasco, Karen had definitely lost her spot on our nice neighbors list. From that point on, Karen mostly kept her distance, probably realizing she'd made a fool of herself by calling the cops on her neighbor for growing tomatoes. Whenever we had a gathering or shared our food with the neighbors, Karen was not included. She could only watch from her window, as everyone else enjoyed our homemade salsas, guacamole, and other delicious dishes, made with the very tomatoes she'd accused me of growing illegally. The whole experience was infuriating and stressful, but in the end, it just made me even more determined to cultivate my love for gardening and enjoy the literal fruits of my labor. And as for Karen, well, she missed out on the joy of our mouth-watering Mexican cuisine all because of her own ignorance and prejudice. Wow, just wow! I can't believe what I just heard from OP's story. I mean, who in their right mind would mistake a tomato plant for marijuana? That's just crazy! And to make matters worse, Karen had the audacity to call the police on OP, causing all sorts of unnecessary drama and embarrassment. But what really gets me is the racist assumptions that Karen made about OP based on his nationality. That's just not cool. It's unacceptable to judge someone based on their ethnicity or cultural background, and it's even worse to accuse them of illegal activity based on those assumptions. I have to give it to OP, though. He handled the situation like a pro. Despite the stress and frustration, he remained calm and respectful when talking to Karen and the police. And I love how he took the high road by not confronting Karen and instead focusing on his love for gardening and cooking. It's just a shame that Karen missed out on the opportunity to enjoy OP's delicious Mexican cuisine. I mean, who wouldn't want to try homemade salsas and guacamole made with fresh tomatoes? But hey, that's her loss. So what do you guys think of this situation? Have you ever had a nosy or entitled neighbor like Karen? Let me know in the comments below. A Karen and her entitled family tried to sue me for everything I inherited from my loving grandparents who disowned them for their mistreatment of me. But the judge saw through their lies and ruled in my favor. Here's what happened. Subscribe to You're the Jerk to never miss an upload. I was born when my mother and father were only 17. It forced both of my parents to drop out of high school and each get a GED so they could find work right away. My father especially was not happy about this because he had dreams of playing football in college, and instead he had to work at a gas station. He said to my face many times that I ruined his dream. My mother hardly raised me at all as she had to work too. They had a cranky old lady next door watch me most of the time. She wasn't so bad. She gave me more attention than my parents did. My father eventually managed to land a better job as a manager due to his experience running the gas station. It was right after that my mom got pregnant with my sister. I was 6 when she was born. I wasn't exactly shown much love before that, but once my sister came along, it was made pretty obvious to even my 6-year-old self that I was unwanted. The only ones who seemed to care were my paternal grandparents and somewhat my babysitter. And they were more like my parents, because they treated me the way a little kid needed to be loved. We lived in a 2-bedroom apartment, and as my sister got older, it went from me sharing a bedroom with her to me kicked out of the room entirely. I slept on the couch for 2 years, and I barely had anything to my name other than clothes, school supplies, and an old Game Boy. When I was 10, my parents decided they were going to move away. But this move did not include me. I ended up actually being fine with this, as my grandparents had agreed to take me in. My life was instantly better. I got my own room again, and my grandparents gifted me a brand new N64 in 1996. That Christmas, I got a Game Boy Pocket too. And there were a couple of other kids my age in the neighborhood I got to hang out with. We rode bikes, played video games, shot cans with pellet guns, built forts, and got dirty playing in the creek. You know, stuff a normal kid would enjoy. I was finally happy. As time went on, I grew up and eventually moved out, but later moved back in to help my grandparents' house as they were getting old and living off their retirement savings. So some rent money from me went a long way in paying the bills. My grandpa was the kind of person who'd wanted to build a bomb shelter during the Cold War, but never got around to it. He wanted to volunteer for the military in the 60s, but was turned down due to a medical condition, and the fact his eyesight was not great. So he focused on saving whatever he thought he needed. He told me many times it was better to have something and not need it than need it and not have it. Our area suffered from numerous power outages in winter due to heavy winds and storms. So having gasoline and propane for heaters and generators was a must. All these saving habits became my own as time went on, because it was better to need this stuff rarely than not have it at all. Of course, there was the HOA bothering us, but that's its own other story. The problem is, about 5 years back, my grandma died suddenly, and my grandpa was heartbroken. He also went about a year and a half later. Pretty much everything they owned was willed to me. Their savings, their house, their vehicles, their stuff. Everything. The house was long paid off, and Grandpa knew how to keep up with its maintenance. In fact, after Grandma died, he kind of doubled down on renovating the place. He had the roof redone, the house was repainted by us inside and out, and we fixed a lot of little things. Grandpa's neighbor George even came by to help redo the plumbing. Ironically, the HOA was rather happy with these changes because the house didn't look run down anymore. One morning I was fixing breakfast and my grandpa never came downstairs. You couldn't keep the man from his bacon, so I went to check on him, and he wasn't moving. I called 911 and paramedics came, only to tell me he'd passed in his sleep. My parents made Grandpa's funeral a shit show. They didn't bother to show up for Grandma's. They were too busy. And at Grandpa's funeral, they didn't seem to grieve at all. My sister also showed up wearing a brightly colored designer dress, which I wasn't happy about as it was a church clothes-only function. I noticed my parents repeatedly whispering to each other and glaring at me whenever I looked at them. Come to find out at the will reading that my parents knew that they'd been disinherited long ago for their treatment of me, and they thought it extremely unfair. I got everything. They threatened to sue me to contest the will, and I got repeated calls and messages from my father, mother, and sister telling me I needed to do the right thing and give my father what was supposed to be his. I told them all to flake off in far more unsavory words. My parents ended up taking me to court to challenge the will. But the judge ruled in my favor after seeing the will and hearing us both out. So it wasn't a long drawn-out legal battle. The judge even looked at my parents with absolute disgust after seeing the will and hearing about their mistreatment of me in my childhood. He called my father a terrible parent and that my grandparents were right to disown him. My father just hung his head in silence, but he made sure to stop me outside the courtroom and tell me I was always the biggest mistake of his life, and that if he could go back in time, he'd make sure I never existed. He should have been a football star, and instead, he has to wear a name tag for a 9 to 5. I told him that mistake or not, Grandma and Grandpa could see what kind of nasty person he was. I didn't ask to be born, and the only real love I ever got was from my grandparents, and he was no father of mine anymore. I got a few more threatening and harassing phone calls as well as some letters from my parents, all demanding money among other things, but over time they just stopped because I completely stonewalled them. Never responded to the emails or letters, and I stayed silent during the phone calls. A few times I just left the phone sitting on the counter with them ranting till they realized I wasn't listening. Aside from not getting the house or money, my parents seemed particularly irked. They could not even get a rise out of me. But I was prepared to go to war against them, and they knew it. So in the end, they just left me alone. From what I know looking at Facebook the past decade, my sister tried to get into modeling, got married, had 2 kids, got divorced, and is currently unhappily working a job she feels is beneath her. My mother currently works retail and is also vocal about her disdain of it. Like my father, she peaked in high school. She was a cheerleader back then, and even had her old uniform framed on the wall. My father has pretty much had the same job for 25 years. He must be good at it if he's still doing it. As for me, well, I'm in my late 30s now, and I live pretty much debt-free in a nice neighborhood. I haven't really had a girlfriend since high school, and I've had little motivation to ever have another relationship. But loneliness gets to everyone, so maybe I'll try to find someone soon. Not many are in the financial position I'm in at my age. Single, paid-off house, 2 vehicles, and a decent amount in the bank. I guess I could aim to be a stepfather. That might be more my speed. Oh my gosh, OP, this story is just crazy. I can't believe your parents had the audacity to blame you for their life choices and then try to take everything from you after your grandparents passed away. I mean, talk about entitlement. The fact that your dad would say you ruined his dream to your face is just mind-blowing. And the whole court situation? Pure Karen madness right there. But props to you for standing your ground and staying strong. You really showed them who's boss. It's amazing how you were able to make a better life for yourself despite everything you went through. You've definitely come out on top, and that's something to be proud of. My father calls me abusive for getting medical treatment. He accuses me of lying about my medical condition, and then threatens to remove me from the family's insurance plan for wasting resources. Here's what happened when I decided to tell them the truth. My parents' favorite thing to accuse me of is being a manipulative liar, which is funny because I'm genuinely the world's worst liar. I'm too dumb to be good at it, and I instantly get nervous and start stuttering just because of the sheer stress. I've always been more comfortable being honest, even when it's gotten me in trouble. It gets me in trouble a lot with my parents because they really don't like to be told what they don't want to hear. Those of you who may have read the first post I made on this sub might remember my parents are, let's say, wary of modern medicine. They don't like mental health professionals of any kind. They are selectively anti-vaxxers. Some they're okay with, some they're convinced will turn you inside out, depending on what articles reach them on Facebook. And they don't believe in certain kinds of treatments or procedures for various ideological reasons that are all very silly. Just to paint a picture, my mother has given me healing crystals more than once over various ailments I've went through. They are lucky my brother and I never got gravely ill as children. I was having a perfectly normal conversation with my mother on the phone yesterday when I accidentally let slip I had a consultation booked a week from now with a doctor. I hadn't mentioned it to my parents at all because it's one of those medical procedures they do not approve of. I still hadn't come up with a good lie as to why I was going back into surgery in a few months or so, or how I could maybe explain it away. My mother, already ready to go off upon hearing this, asked me what for. I rolled a 1 on persuasion. I just couldn't come up with anything that'd satisfy them on the spot. My mother is going off on me for lying. My father starts yelling in the background too. They start making threats to get me off of the family's insurance plan for wasting resources. Which would suck because my meds are $350 a month. I just started a new job and my benefits won't kick in for another 2 months. I get off the phone with them. At lunch, I decide I'm just going to rip the bandage off then and there. I tell them over text the truth, that I knew they'd react badly and that if they're going to really take me off the insurance plan to let me know as soon as possible so I can hop on Blue Cross. They call me a few hours later. My mom goes off telling me that it's your choice, but you're hurting me by doing it and hurting me for lying about it. She's crying. I honestly wanted to just start laughing. My dad disagrees. He informs me that he feels that this is a family matter, that he wants me to come down to their house so it can be discussed in person. My body, my health, a family matter. For context, I don't have a car. Their house is in another city in an area where if no one drives me, I'm trapped there. I tell him no, that I only told them so there's no confusion why I'm going back in for surgery. And this is the last time it's going to be brought up, that I refuse to talk about it further, and I'm not stranding myself with them only to get cornered about it. That's the point in which my father drops the zinger. With all this lying and manipulating and you trying to tear the family apart like this, I feel like I'm being abused. Stunning. I got off the phone with them and have their contacts blocked for right now so I can focus on my job, which is the best job I've ever had. Best paying, good benefits, and good work. I'm putting this in here as a reprieve. They'll get over it. I'll start my application to Blue Cross just in case. It will be cheaper than paying in full for my meds. Wow, OP, your parents sound like they're straight out of a movie. I can't believe they're so against modern medicine that they would even threaten to take you off their insurance plan for wanting to go to a doctor. And the fact that they're selectively anti-vaxxers just adds to the craziness of it all. But the icing on the cake has to be your mother giving you healing crystals over actual medical treatment. It's truly baffling that they would consider your own health a family matter and try to guilt trip you by saying they're being abused. That's just plain manipulative behavior on their part. And to think that they accuse you of being a liar when you're genuinely a terrible one. The irony. But on a serious note, I'm glad to hear that you're focusing on your new job, which sounds amazing, by the way. And it's great that you're taking steps to ensure that you have access to medical care, even if your parents do end up taking you off their insurance plan.